Mano, it's great to have Whanonga here from across the region, from the Pacific, from Timor-Leste, and also our colleagues at MFAT and representatives of our own sector, the INGO sector, and other colleagues and consultants. We've been doing, as you know, a series of masterclasses on adaptive management, and you know, part of what we've learned through this process and through COVID is the importance of being agile and the importance of understanding the political context in which we're working. And you know, we're extremely lucky to have someone of Leni Wild's caliber here, and that's part of the way we're approaching this, to be sharing lessons learnt and the latest thinking around adaptive management from across the globe. And you couldn't get anyone better than Leni. She's extremely well respected in circles, not just in adaptive management, but in the practical application of these ideas, which I know is something we've talked a lot about in the classes. And just to give you a bit of background on Leni, Leni's a former director of GLAM, which I have to say, Leni, is probably the best acronym that the development sector's come up with so far. But that's Global Learning on Adaptive Management Initiative, and it was set up, I think, with DFID funding and Canadian funding, I think.
Yes.
And also, I mean, you've now moved on from that, but you're also you've maintained your connection with ODI, with the organisation in the UK, where I think you're a research associate. But the thing that I think is really exciting for us is that Leni's experience of applying these ideas in the field. So Leni's worked in many politically fraught environments, post-conflict, in countries like, I'm just going to list them here. I mean, it just gives you an idea of the experience that she's had. Uganda, Sierra Leone, Gaza, Malawi, Tanzania, South Sudan. So, you know, it's wonderful to have you, Leni, who can help us work through what these ideas mean to the way that we all work, whether we're donors, whether we're INGOs, or whether we're working and living in countries. So, so welcome to New Zealand from afar. Thank you for getting up so early. And we will be recording this and sharing it with widely with our sector and with others. But yeah, thank you, Leni, and we're really looking forward to this. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for that very kind introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining in, especially at the end of your days. I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you actually about some of your experiences. And what I thought I'd do today is to reflect a little bit on why I think adaptive management matters, but focus, as Josie said, very much on some of the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of this, and what I see as some of the key sort of operational barriers, the things that are currently getting in the way, and some ideas and strategies of how to get around those. So I guess, I mean, I think we're all, you know, living through the current pandemic, coronavirus, COVID-19, and I think it's changing all of our lives and ways of working in sort of unimaginable ways, even just a few months ago. But I think what it also is doing is it's really shining a spotlight on the role of data, of evidence, in guiding decision-making, and the ways in which you have to do that when you face significant unknowns and a very fast-moving, complex problem. So it's also the sort of archetypal case of why we need to be adaptive and to work in adaptive ways. What it's requiring is collective decision-making that can interpret and use the best available evidence on an ongoing basis to constantly learn as you go about what else you need to be doing and how you need to be changing some of your responses. And I think many countries are now moving into this phase of having to sort of adaptively trigger different interventions, often in quite localized ways, to respond to outbreaks and flare-ups. And again, all of that to me is really underlining this idea that we need to be better at understanding and adapting to local realities, learning as we go, being able to be agile and dynamic in how we respond to something. So it's really putting a spotlight on the things that I think matter. but will it create more space in international development and the realms that we all work to work in these ways? I'm not so sure, and I'll return to some of that at the end of this. I think what it does show, this current pandemic, is it really reinforces what we know doesn't work in international development and aid. And there's been very long-running critiques of this. I won't spend too much time here. But for me, the key criticisms that I see are, firstly, that we often become too, what I would call, projectized. So we focus very much on the project, the plan, and implementers and those delivering support get very much held to account for their compliance with that project plan, rather than thinking about what we're doing in terms of a wider perspective of how we're trying to support change in a given place, how we have to manage uncertainty, whether or not we ultimately are achieving the kinds of impacts and results that we want to be achieving. Secondly, I think it's often been too narrow in scope. So again, we very much tend to focus on the assumption that we just need more money, more technical inputs or sort of technocratic solutions, rather than recognizing that, you know, around the world, the problems that we're facing are fundamentally about politics, they're about behaviors, they're about incentives, they're about things that are much more complex than that. And finally, that we still tend to see in international development, I think, a very strong preference for following a particular blueprint or a template, often that comes from elsewhere. And I think rather sadly in international development, we rarely see good examples where we genuinely empower organisations to work with local groups to really understand what their problems are and to work with them to develop the locally appropriate solutions that are needed. So I think these are the problems that we face. What can we do differently? Well, one of the things I've been doing over the last few years, I've been part of convening something called the Doing Development Differently Network, which has been trying to push for change, particularly from some of the big bilateral and multilateral donor agencies and how they work. And there's lots of different acronyms that are out there, lots of different terms and kind of buzzwords being used in this kind of space at the moment. But for me, what we're essentially talking about are three key ingredients. So the first is the idea of what I would call being problem focused and being politically smart. So what I mean there is we've got to be stronger at really getting to the underlying issues or the problems that are really getting in the way of the outcomes that are needed in a given place. We've got to be asking lots of why questions, essentially, to get at those underlying structural problems. And often what we find is that, yes, for the solutions, there's obviously technical elements about what the right reform is, but a lot of it is about the political environment. It's about thinking about what kind of coalitions do you need to build of key people to support the reform that's needed? And how do you do that in environments that are often politically challenging, complex in lots of ways, uncertain in lots of ways? So we need to think about being politically smart in that process as well. Secondly, I think it's about being flexible, adaptive, agile, lots of these phrases that get used. Again, to me, often in development work, we identify a problem, but we're not very good at identifying what the right method of figuring out the solution is. So what I mean by that is, when we're dealing with problems that are, as I said, complex, uncertain, politically challenging, rather than assuming we know how to achieve that change, what we need are these quite fast cycles of doing something, testing it, learning about how it's going, having scope to make changes as we go, and having that be a sort of constant cycle in what we're doing. We need really strong feedback loops from all sorts of different people that we're engaging with as part of that process, so that we're always testing our initial ideas about how change will happen. And then we have scope to change what we're doing in light of what we've learned. And thirdly, I think this is a really crucial bit, it's about being what I would call locally led. So we know that around the world, change is best led by people who are close to a particular problem and who have the greatest stake in its solution. Now, I don't just mean, local communities, so that can be them, but it could be those in central government, in local government, parts of the private sector, whatever your problem is, it's the key people that sit around that problem that need to be involved in thinking about what the solutions are. And again, in international development, we often talk about things like local ownership, participation, but we know it rarely happens substantively in practice. So I think these three key elements need to be there, whatever term, kind of phrase, language you use. And I think we do actually have some pretty good examples now about what this can look like when it works in practice. This one comes from the Philippines. It's with an organisation called the Asia Foundation, which at ODI, where I work, the Overseas Development Institute in London, we had a sort of long-running partnership with them, documenting and learning about what they were doing in a whole number of different countries. They're a large NGO, INGO. And this example from the Philippines, I like because it highlights all of these key elements that I've been talking about that were able to deliver a real result, a really significant result in the country. So this project was about improving the rates of residential land titling, which was a key enabler of access to services around livelihoods and so on. And they were able to achieve, within a matter of a couple of years, a really significant improvement in the number of land titles that were issued to people. And it did that by following the key elements that I've just talked about. For example, it very much had at its core this idea of these very kind of quite fast circles of action, reflection and learning, and then thinking about what else it might need to do in response to what it had learned. It set up what it called the idea of sort of making small bets. So starting with a number of activities in parallel where it wasn't sure exactly which ones were the right ones, and over time identifying which ones were getting more traction and which ones would need to be stopped. So for instance, around this particular project, they set up one team that built a new digital database around land titling, which they thought was going to be the area most likely to achieve the reform. But alongside that, they pursued a number of other things, including particular legislative reform. And actually, the digital platform quickly got mired in bureaucratic infighting within government and didn't get anywhere. So they stopped funding it, they stopped doing it, and they focused instead on the other areas that were getting more traction and that eventually led to this reform. I think what was really key to this were the people involved, had this kind of very multi-skilled team at the core of this. They even had an internet entrepreneurs. They had a sort of a very diverse team of people who were working on this. And at their heart, they had this really good understanding about the sort of underlying power realities. And, as we all know, land is often big business. There are lots of entrenched interests there and lots of powerful people who are threatened by some of these reforms. So they had to be really careful about how they approached it and how they kind of brought people in that were needed to support their reform. They also had a supportive funding arrangement. This was funded by USAID, the US Development Agency. It had a bit more flexibility than their usual contract, so it wasn't quite a grant, but it was sort of somewhere in between. And they had a really good working relationship with the lead on the funder side from USAID, and actually had a lot of really informal catch-ups, discussions, talking them through what they were doing. So that person always knew where the project was at and was very confident in how it was going. And I like this example because there's also a counterfactual. There was a very long-running, a very large technical assistance program funded by the World Bank that had run for about 10 years, spending a huge amount of money and had achieved almost nothing. And this project, in just a couple of years, with much less funding, achieved a significant change. Now, I'm sure we might all have seen examples and know of examples of this kind in different places. But I think the real challenge for us is how do we move from a set of good examples to more sustained changes in practice? And to me, what's needed are changes or thinking about three different levels. So the first is thinking about the changes to some of the systems and processes, I think particularly of some of the big donor agencies and the funding models that we have in international development. Thinking about that in the context of understanding the behaviours, the incentives that exist within aid and international development. And then thinking about the role of leadership. How do we get leaders to be pushing for change, but also creating the right working environments in different organisations so staff feel able to work in these sorts of ways. So thinking about those changes to systems and processes, there's lots I could say here. I'll focus on just a few examples for now. But I think, so for instance, a lot of the common practice that I've seen in some of the places I've worked for international development support is that you have projects that have identified a goal and then are sort of forced to specify all of the activities for how they're going to achieve that goal up front. And then what happens in reality is they get quite tied to those activities, but the goal itself gets a bit lost, and often changes the activities you're doing aren't going to quite achieve that. And I think we need to be turning it around. We need to be setting out up front quite a clear goal, objectives, the change that we want to see, and that should remain quite fixed. And then what you should have is, rather than having to specify all of your activities and outputs, if you like, for how to achieve that, you should have to specify a very clear, a structured process for how you will test and learn to figure out the right sets of activities at a given point in time to achieve that goal. I think what this requires from a funder perspective is that you're assessing what you're supporting based on how well it's learning and adapting, not on whether it's stuck to the plan that it originally said it would follow, as well as whether you've actually achieved the results that were set at the start, or that kind of key outcome that you wanted to achieve. And we've been calling this, and this was coined in some of the work I did in GLAM, as Josie mentioned, the idea of adaptive rigor. And we wanted to use that to emphasize that you can still be rigorous, but you practice some of that differently when you're working in these sorts of ways. And where the rigor to me comes in is that what you're very rigorous about is documenting your decision-making process. So what did you aim to do? What kinds of evidence did you collect? What sorts of decisions did that lead you to? And how do you therefore change your strategy? And you build up a very strong documentation of that process. And that's really what you're held to account for. Because ultimately what you want is those very strong performance incentives to achieve the end result, alongside having quite a lot of discretion and flexibility around the activities for how to get there. And I think what's interesting is that there's lots of examples, including outside of international development, for how that kind of accountability can work. We've been calling it forms of sort of narrative accountability. So for instance, in the US, around their child protection services, they use things that are called quality service reviews, which essentially give a lot of discretion to frontline staff around the decisions they can make day to day, but has this very strong emphasis that they need to articulate their decision-making process and have documented it, so that someone can go back and understand, how did you get to this point in time? What sorts of evidence did you use? How did you make that decision? Okay, well, we can see that. We can then judge whether that was the right choice that you made based on the evidence that you had. In the US example, they also do a sort of random sample of interventions that are more intensively reviewed to serve as a bit of a test about whether the overall system is working. But it's not, it's not the sort of same level of reporting against your activities and outputs that I think probably most of us are used to if we've been working in international development for some time. So thinking about that as the model, what sorts of changes are needed? Well, I think first of all, we need to be changing contracting and procurement models. Again, shifting the idea away from accountability and funding that's based around your predetermined deliverables to accountability around testing and learning for how to achieve an ultimate set of impacts. And again, there are practical ways that we know we can do this. So there are forms of what we call more relational contract models. So for instance, in the private sector, what we've been looking at is, a lot of big multinationals don't set up contracts that pre-specify all of their deliverables. They think that's sort of ridiculous. What they do is they set up contracts that set the terms of their relationship. So how will they be making decisions? How will they be determining what the right deliverables are at a given point in time? So that's what you focus on in your contracting, is setting out the nature of your relationship with each other and your decision-making processes, rather than exactly what it is you'll be doing day to day. Some donors have started to experiment with this. And others, so USAID, for example, has also been finding it useful to build in, if you like, sort of co-design as part of their tender process. So even before they've released their procurement documents, they bring in and work with potential bidders to design those documents with them. And the idea is that you make that more realistic, it's better reflective of the groups who actually want to deliver that work. And they've found that it's led to improvements in their overall procurement process as a result. Examples, donors certainly in the UK and elsewhere that I've looked at have recently by results as a common contracting model. And I think in general what we have found is that it's really hard to square that with working in these sorts of ways. And it needs to be done very carefully. And I can talk about that more if that's been an issue for any of you as well. But I think contracting really matters. One point that we need to change some of our reporting mechanisms to reflect this. So again, we can still be accountable, we can still be rigorous in how we report, but we need to do that differently. So for instance, there are ways that you can set learning indicators so that you can really be testing and having oversight of how well organisations are doing that learning. You can set the boundaries for that so that you specify, where that learning should be focused, where actually it's needed less and things are more predictable. What's been interesting, for instance, I've worked a lot with DFID, which is the UK Development Agency, and they've been trying to change how they conduct their annual reviews. They do an annual review of the performance of all of the projects that they fund. And for projects that they identify as being more experimental or adaptive, they're changing how they review them and essentially score them so that it's based on understanding how well that project has learned and responded to what it's learned, including changing its approach in a given year, rather than the way they tend to score projects at the moment, which is very much whether they delivered what they said they were going to do at the start of the year. So I think it is possible to change reporting. But finally, I mentioned all of this, the staffing that you need to work in these sorts of ways. And again, I think we know now what some of the key staff skills are for working in this sort of way. We need staff who are curious, who are creative, who have critical thinking, who are open to recognising risk and have some level of comfort with uncertainty. And you can start to specify some of that in recruitment, in reward and promotion for key roles. There are also organisations that I think are starting to really think about how do you kind of build the culture and reward for this internally in other ways. So for instance, a number of agencies that I've worked with have been setting up internal champions networks around being adaptive, agile, etc., to try and really promote this, to show that they care about it, that they're investing in it. I think we do also, though, need to recognise that managing and working on programmes that work in these ways is much more time intensive. It needs more staff time and investment around monitoring, overseeing, liaising with different partners. And you do need staff, I think, in my experience, who are experienced enough to kind of have a certain level of judgment and a confidence to work in these ways. So we need to be thinking about the kind of human side, I think, really importantly as well. And I guess linked to that and underlying it, we need to think about leadership across all of our organisations and the kinds of what I would call sort of working cultures or the ways of working that we have and what needs to change there. I've been recently looking at some interesting examples of governments who've been really trying to create what some people are calling a sort of culture of continuous improvement. So you really make it part of the DNA of an organisation. So in Singapore, for instance, they've set up things called work improvement teams to sort of actively create that as part of the working culture within government. But we know that, essentially you need leaders who are creating the right environment to work in these ways. And in the best case, leaders of organizations, of teams, will role model these approaches themselves. So the example I mentioned in the Philippines of the Asia Foundation, they had a head of office who really practiced this stuff himself. You know, he created these regular Monday morning meetings that he made very open, where he himself reflected on strategy, what he had been learning, how his thinking had changed, the things he thought he could have done differently and better. And it really kind of just set the tone in the office that this was the way they were going to be working, and that everyone should feel comfortable, safe to work in these ways, to raise problems, to show when things weren't working. Now, we know we don't always have that best case. Certainly, I've worked in organisations that don't have that. But I think at a minimum, what you want is that the leaders of an organisation or a team or a project that you're in are not blocking it. They don't have to be practicing this themselves necessarily, but they need to allow the space for staff to work in these ways. And I think one of the ways you can ensure they don't block it is by showing that reassurance that oversight is still happening. Again, that you're still being rigorous and accountable, you're just doing it in different ways. So again, as I've been saying, it's not about specifying all of your deliverables and activities, which is often what we use, I think, in international development to try to give that reassurance. But instead it's specifying how decisions are taken, on what basis, using what data, how often is that reviewed, by whom, you know, how does that happen collectively, so it's not just a person sat in a room making that decision. And what we've found is that all of that is really, really key for maintaining confidence in the overall program management, the monitoring processes, the oversight processes, so that if and when changes are needed, you know, if you figure out actually this wasn't the right thing to do, we need to shift, you can still have confidence that the overall systems are working well. It's not just because you didn't know what you were doing. But all of that requires a much higher level, I think, of openness, of transparency at different levels and across different organisations than we currently practice. So a few final thoughts from me in terms of what I think some of the priorities are here. I think that first of all, we need to recognise that I think many staff in donor agencies, but also in implementing organisations of different kinds, can still find it easier to be, if you like, sort of reactive or responsive once a programme is up and running, than to really recognise that uncertainty from the start and plan for it. You know, I think there is still this really strong kind of perceived hunger for certainty that we need to pretend that we all know exactly how we're going to achieve some particular change, rather than really having incentives to have robust systems for dealing with uncertainty, which we know is the reality. And I do think trying to move towards doing this more by design rather than by default, if you like, is key. And there are ways that we can do that, and I've tried to give a few examples. But I do think that results frameworks are a real challenge here, and the way we currently approach results and reporting is a big problem in many cases. That hunger for certainty is really obvious when you look at a lot of the reporting frameworks that people are using, which I think everyone often knows doesn't really reflect reality, but you kind of end up having to agree with them anyway to get some funding off the ground and a project going. But there are ways we can change those frameworks. There are examples out there. And as I've been saying, I think what's key is really thinking about what's the best way of documenting how a program is testing, is learning, the kinds of knowledge and information it's drawing on, and that needs to be what your reporting is built around. Thirdly, I think there is a danger that some of what we're talking about here becomes, if you like, a bit of a micro agenda. It becomes a bit about sort of tinkering with project management techniques. I think some of the adaptive management language can a little bit fall into that category. So it's about making changes, kind of what seem like quite small changes to program delivery. Whereas to me, what it needs to be is actually a new way or a different way of thinking about how change happens, how we support transformative change, how we really empower local decision making in different ways. So I guess linked to that, when I talked about those three ingredients at the start, what I see is that genuine sort of local leadership of problem solving is the biggest challenge still. There's a few examples of interesting models of giving more sort of arm's length funding, but I think that a lot of donors still really are falling down in that commitment to genuinely empower groups to solve problems for themselves. And finally, I think we do need to think, I think one of the barriers, the kind of strong soft barriers here, if you like, are the dominant management styles, the organizational cultures that exist in lots of development organizations, particularly international development organizations. And we need to think a bit creatively about how we can change that. So for instance, we've been looking at things like the idea of how do you create that as a working environment where you're focused on identifying errors, problems, and solving them rather than trying to sort of make them go away. And in the airline industry, they have this thing called the positive error culture. So they have this relentless focus on identifying errors in order to correct them. So staff are not penalised for that. They're actively encouraged to constantly put up their hands, say when things haven't worked, why, so that you can take action. And I think we need to think about how do we create that as the dominant way of working across different organisations. And I guess finally, I think just returning back to the sort of current pandemic that we're all living through, and again, sat here in the UK and I guess looking at many of you who I think are sat in New Zealand, I think what this current pandemic shows is that the nature of leadership and the leadership that can practice some of these elements is being most successful. And we're quite envious over here of what we're seeing from some of the other leaders in other countries. So I would hope that over time that does create more space for this conversation in international development. But I do also worry that the current pandemic is going to make a lot of donor agencies more inward looking. It's reinforcing more centralizing rather than decentralizing tendencies, and could actually reinforce some of this sort of hunger for certainty, this focus on the technical solutions, the quick fixes. So I do have some worries about how well we'll be able to maintain what I think was quite a growing movement and trend to push in this direction. But I think the best we can do is to sort of continue that struggle and see how it plays out. So thank you all for listening, and look forward to some of your reflections.
Thanks, Leni. That was fantastic. I feel like you dive right into the DNA of our organisations, and it's hugely challenging for all of us. But also, despite your words of warning, it is really hopeful. And the group we've got here, and there are actually more people than it looks like, because there's the groups of people gathered around one computer. But you've got represented in this group both, all three. You've got donors, you've got implementing partners in country, and you've got INGOs. So it's the DNA of all our different organisations is what you've been sort of delving into. And so I'm going to ask people to ask questions. And while you're thinking of questions, I'll start off with one, because you talk about the hunger for certainty being a problem, and it's true. What do you do when that hunger for certainty is driven often by political masters who are being driven by a public desire to have certainty? Does this work? Is this having impact? Is my dollar donation here or my taxpayers' money working? So how do you deal with that political drive for certainty from politicians and from the public?
Shall I answer that, and then we'll see if others want to come in?
Yes, that would be great, Leni. And then there's there's a question from Ciali, which she's asked before, I know, about how we embed the stuff we've learnt in COVID. So I'll come to you next, Ciali. But yeah, maybe answer that and then to Ciali.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a big one. And funnily enough, one of the things I've done over the last few years is to try to delve a bit into this perception we have that it's public opinion and that kind of public desire for certainty that is pushing us to work in these ways. And we actually did a whole set of consultations and public engagement around the UK to try to understand a bit better what public opinion really was on international development, because the current opinion polling is often quite superficial. It doesn't give you a good sense of what the public's really thinking. We went to different parts of the UK, different countries within the UK, and actually what we found is that the sort of general public, in many ways, understand very well that this stuff is challenging and complex. You know, they understand that if you're trying to work in, from the UK's perspective, somewhere like Nigeria, somewhere like Uganda, South Sudan, they kind of actually have this implicit understanding that that is not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, it's not going to probably be solved by throwing a bit of money at it. And interestingly, where they're starting to be much more skeptical around aid and development, it's because they've been told that this is easy, straightforward, we know the solution, we can do it, but yet they see those problems aren't being fixed, that's making them turn off their support. So I think we need a little bit of a reflection on whether some of our assumptions about what drives this are the right ones, because I'm not convinced they are. I think there is an issue around how you bring kind of political leadership in, however, because I think sometimes they do have assumptions about what their publics are asking of them. Or, you know, often, I mean, in the UK at least, we've had a whole series of Secretaries of State for International Development who have no background or understanding of international development before they're given that role. And so there is a process of thinking about how you bring them on that journey. I guess what I've found to be effective is to show that this is not what you're sort of, the sort of changes that I've been talking about are not, you know, they're not completely crazy, they're not off the wall, they're actually common ways of working, you know, to kind of normalize it a bit. And interestingly, so for instance, in the UK, public policy, what we've found in trying to deal with things like homelessness, drug addiction, sort of chronic social problems, is that this idea that you can set a target, have a plan, try to stick to it, doesn't work either. So there's a big shift, I think, in public policy thinking, that you need these sorts of adaptive, localized, more user-led processes. So I think it's, you know, I think we need to be doing more to align with and join up with those who are pushing for change in lots of different ways, to show that this is not something that has never been done, that is impossible, that we don't have good examples of, because we do. It's just some of them come from outside of international development.
Yeah, great answer. We've got two questions that are similar actually. So if I go to Ciali and then Augusto to ask some questions and get you to answer that, and then to you, Molly. So Ciali, are you there?
Thank you, Josie, for convening the space for us to come back again, and probably this is what Leni's talking about, is having this space to articulate and you know, in brainstorm and hear what other people are doing. I think it's a questions and in a couple of points throwing out is how we had observed our Pacific countries responding to COVID, where we realized that we don't want to go back. We don't want to. We want to see something change. What we are hearing people about, the new normal. But the actual practice of things that we have seen is just the old way of doing things. And we've recognized that it, you know, in this kind of adaptive management, what we need to see a lot more is probably the thinking process, taking time to reflect. And unfortunately, in a situation like now, we don't have that time. You know, people are expecting government and everyone to respond, and so we are like running. We are just like ongoing, you know, trying to do what we think that we can do to help. And I have seen that a lot more with our civil society compared to government, where probably this is where the political interest are coming in, And I don't see anyone owning up to say that we have done, that we had mess up. That's why we don't have any health system that is adequate enough to test people, because we have shifted from where we should have been. So owning up to those is probably where we would love to see, so that it can take us forward in a new way. And I can talk about that forever, Leni, but the actual putting that into practice, or putting that into policy directions, is something that I would like to ask you. How do we do that? Thank you.
Thank you, Siali. And Leni, just so you know, Siali runs the umbrella organisation across the whole Pacific, so like Bond, but across the whole Pacific region. It's a small job. And Augusto, you had a similar question actually about the politics in Timor-Leste and changes of government. Do you want to ask that question too? It'd be great to get you to say that one.
Yes, thank you very much. I was kind of trying to ask Leni if there is any similar experiences in other country where there are changes or in political environment or changes of government that suddenly happen where you have to adapt and into those political changes, and how you deal with it and make sure that the program can still continue on and addressing the priorities or helping to address the priorities of the government, and that not compromise some of the importance aspect of the programs, such as the goal of the programs and the outcomes of the program. Because sometimes we have to adapt with the needs, and sometimes the need is not aligned with the initial design of the program, how you would deal with that one. So that's my sort of question that I would like to get some sort of insight from Leni in terms of other experience come across like this situation in Timor-Leste. Thank you.
Leni, thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for those two really thoughtful reflections. I think the reality is these are the core things that we're all trying to grapple with, and I think they are magnified in the current crisis, as Siali was saying. I think that I guess one of the key messages that I try to make sure I emphasize whenever I'm talking about this as a way of working is that I don't claim that it's easy or straightforward or is happening everywhere. And I think there's a danger, there's a lot of sort of cheerleading and creating a buzz around this stuff without recognizing that it's hard. I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that that idea of owning up to mistakes, Siali, is very difficult. It's very difficult on a personal level. When I have myself tried to run programs that work in adaptive learning ways, it's very hard when you think something's going to work and it doesn't, to say that and to be publicly held to account for that. So this isn't easy on a sort of personal and individual level. And I think we know that politically, politicians do not like to admit that something has not worked. And, I very much appreciate that where you're sitting, that's a very difficult and sort of complex reality. It's, I think, one that many of us, I sit in the UK, where we also have a government that has not been able to own up to many mistakes that it's made in handling this current crisis. And it's something that has caused a lot of, I think, frustration for many people as well. I think that the sort of how do you do it in practice, I guess the one thing I would try to emphasize is that I think you're right. On the one hand, you need these sort of thinking time and reflection processes, but you also need to recognize things are moving fast and there's not a lot of time or scope to do that. But I think we sometimes assume that thinking and reflection process has to be something very long, involved, sort of quite cumbersome, but it can be something that is done quite quickly. As I mentioned in the Philippines example, they just had a kind of 1 to 2 hour Monday morning, let's sit round, let's reflect, what's changing, what is the government currently thinking on this? What are some of the key people we're trying to work with? How are they changing? What does that mean? How do we need to respond to that? So I think it's about thinking about ways that you can build even quite short reflection processes in, and encouraging others to do that as well. And as much as possible, encouraging those to be collective in some way. So it's not always possible to set up something which is truly representative and has everyone around the table, particularly in a fast, moving environment, or where there's sensitivities about who sits at that table. But you need to try and open up some of that decision making so that it's not just a particular group, an individual making those decisions on their own based on their interpretation of evidence or of what's happening, but in different ways that is being exposed to different opinions, others are being brought in. So I think, there are ways in which you can do that can themselves be quite fast, dynamic, quite responsive, and in some ways it's sometimes about showing decision makers of different kinds, whoever it is you're dealing with, that this is not going to create a lot of additional work for them. It's not going to make it difficult for them. It's actually going to help them. It's going to make things easier. It's going to make their decisions stronger, more effective. And there's often a little bit of work to be done to think with them about what's going to be the right process for that. How can you build it into how they're already working, but just try to expand perhaps even slightly or in small ways, the people who are sat around the table, the ways in which you can build a bit more of that reflection and challenge in different ways. So I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. I think, again, everything is very much about the environment you're in and the realities you're grappling with, but thinking about some of those principles and being a little bit maybe creative or pragmatic about how you can start to incorporate them, I think is a good way forward. And then to Augusto's comments, I think in some ways your question, how do you deal when there are these big changes in government, in the political environment, and so on? In a way, that's sort of the heart of what I'm talking about, is that what we need to think about when we're working on a particular intervention, a program, project, whatever we call it, is from the start, we're planning that that's likely to happen, and we're building it into our planning about what that means and how we might respond, and thinking about different scenarios and thinking about different options. So I think, in a way, some of the things that I've been talking about, the ways you set up your reporting, your contracts, the kind of relationships you have with funders or with other partners, from the start, they need to be premised on the idea that change is likely and will happen. So I think there are some ways you can make the systems, the processes help you better, rather than often, I think at the moment, they hinder that and don't allow you to recognize that reality. But then there's also the relational part, the human side of this. And I think, for example, one of the challenges, I think, when I've, some of the countries that I've worked in, South Sudan, etc., where there have been sort of significant shifts in individuals and people in key parts of government and the political landscape, is that you build up a whole set of relationships, and those relationships are often the key things that are determining the success of what you're doing, and then you have to start again. And unfortunately, I think that is just, it's a little bit of the reality, but it also does reinforce that idea of really thinking about a quite diverse set of people that you're working with from the start. So, as I mentioned in the Philippines example again, they had this really diverse set of people. They had real kind of political insiders. In the Philippines case, it's a small community. You have a few families who essentially have dominated the political landscape for a very long time. A lot of sort of patronage is based around that. And so they essentially had people on their team who had been to school with some of those people, who knew that, who moved in those networks, who understood them, who could help them think about how to navigate them. But they also had grassroots activists. They had lawyers who really understood the Constitution and what it allowed and didn't. So they were sort of able to use, when some of the key political people they were working with lost favour, were less influential, that they could kind of then start to deploy other things. So again, there's no easy answer here. I think it's partly about making sure that from the start, your processes, your systems are going to allow you to deal with uncertainty and assume it's going to happen rather than not. But also there's that point about the kind of diversity of the the network that you engage with, the relationships that you have, and not becoming too reliant on one, so that it then can scupper everything that you do, and thinking about, you know, okay, well, if this bit shuts down, what's the other thing that is going to have, you know, is still going to have some support for, that we can focus on for a time while we build back up the relationships in other areas. So again, I've seen a number of projects that try to operate more, if you like, as kind of portfolios with a number of different things happening that will in different ways try to achieve that end goal, rather than, if you like, putting everything into one set of activities as the thing that's going to achieve change. So I hope that helps, but I'm sure, you know, this is a live issue and a reality for you, so I don't claim that I will have the solution, I'm afraid.
Molly from Fair Trade has a question, and it would be great also if any of our MFAT colleagues want to make a comment. Leni, we're lucky in a way that we have a relationship with Foreign Affairs, our colleagues there. They've really pushed the adaptive management agenda themselves. So, but anyway, Molly, you've got a question. I thought I might not have to say this, but unmute yourself, Molly.
There you go. I was just thanking you, Josie, and fantastic, Leni, to see this great work that you're doing. I think it's very exciting for all of us. Just going back to your points about structures and what's different about adaptive approaches, I guess what stuck in my mind is that you were talking about different things and different ways of looking at things, and I guess the one thing that I got sort of stuck on is that it seems to me that you can be particularly adaptive in your management, and I actually have an example of what MFAT has done with fair trade, if you're very clear about what the outcome is. And if the outcome is measurable and the outcome is clear, you know, how many girls are in school, you know, what is the volume of trade that you're going to increase, what, you know, if you have, and all the SDGs enable us to have very specific measurable things that we're actually saying this is going to be the outcome of this project. Then it seems to me that if we can make the structures clear and the outcomes really clear, then the adaptive how we get there can really be much more adaptive. And I guess I just wanted you to sort of comment on that, because I guess from fair trade's perspective, one of the challenges that we find is that we have very, very strong structures that underpin transforming trade, and we have very measurable outcomes about what is the impact of that in terms of minimum prices and premiums. And we feel like that one of our big challenges as a sector is that a lot of times we're dealing with sort of the consequences rather than the causes. And so we're not kind of getting to those underpinning structures. And so if we're dealing with the consequences or the sexy outcomes that are easy to deal with, like child labor, or, you know, these are things that are, you know, they're the consequences of what the structures are not doing. And so I guess I wanted you to comment for me on how we can look at those structures and then be able to collaborate around them a little bit more in a measurable way. And I guess what comes immediately to mind for me, obviously, on that is the Sustainable Development Goals and how we could be collaborating around those in a kind of more profound way. But I guess in my mind, the measurability or the outcomes don't necessarily have to change for it to be agile. And in fact, I think to the extent that your measurable outcomes are really clear, it's easier for a group like MFAT to be flexible about how you do it. And so just the one little example I'll share with you is that we had a revolving fund in a program that we did with MFAT that enabled us to identify gaps in trade supply chains and help producers to make decisions about their own way they were going to fill those gaps. And it gave us the flexibility of funding to kind of bridge those gaps in a very agile way. But the outcome of that was the increased volume of trade. So the outcome wasn't any different than if we'd been doing a specific project. The outcome was a measurable volume increase in trade. So I guess I just wanted you to kind of reflect or help me get my head around how you think those things have interplay with each other, because I worry that if we're not really clear about what the outcomes are and that they're not measurable, they're more soft skills or other things that we know are also very, very important, that it's going to be harder to work with donors on these agile systems rather than easier.
All right, thanks, Molly. And Leni, maybe a quick answer to that, and then Nick, our colleague from Foreign Affairs, has got the final question.
Great, thank you. I think it's a really good question. I think on the one hand, to me, a key shift, as I said, is to set a very clear objective and to kind of keep that quite fixed, and then have your sort of agility, as you say, comes in how you achieve that. And in some ways, yes, if you have something that is clearly measurable, including quantitatively, it can really help you there, because then you can think about, you can constantly be measuring how are we getting and achieving that, and what does that mean about whether we're on the right path. I think there is a danger, though, that measurement can be sat at something which is more of a symptom than a root cause. So I do think, on the one hand, you need to be really, really careful about having the right measure. And again, there's no hard and fast rule for how to get that. But I think if you've had a really good, deep reflection on what the root causes are, that will help you identify what the best sort of proxies or measures are going to be to make sure you're not at the symptom level, you're at the underlying roots. And I think often that process gets quite shortcut. So I think that we need a kind of lengthier process of really being clear about what the root cause is. But I also think, sometimes the kind of core problem that it is you're trying to address is not easily measurable. And that doesn't mean we should think we can't work in these ways. And we can't be a bit creative about how we think about those measures better. So, for instance, we did some work looking at a project in Mozambique that was looking at women's economic empowerment, which, for them was quite hard to pre-specify in advance exactly the different ways to measure that, because it was so multifaceted. But they came up with a way of, for instance, they had goals that over time they would have addressed in a measurable way 3 barriers to women's economic empowerment, and they had a set of examples of what that could be, but they weren't tied, but it had to be option A rather than option B, right? So they had a way of having a results framework that still had them hit at something, but gave them a little bit of room as they went to really think about the best way of getting there. And we worked in Nepal, again, with a sort of economic development program that again had a kind of menu of indicators. So it had a number of things that would show a potential transformative change to different sectors, but it wasn't tied to achieving a particular one. It was given a kind of a menu, and the idea is you had to achieve at least some of them, and it kind of specified how many, but you had some flex so that you could move between those. So I think, again, there are ways. I do think the measurement, we can be a little bit dismissive sometimes, and I come from working in sort of governance and politics, we sort of say this stuff is just really hard to measure. I don't think that's the case, but I do think we need to be a little bit creative and thoughtful about how we measure it, so that we do have a way of knowing whether we're on the right track, but we don't create those perverse incentives where we're sort of just treating the symptom and not the cause.
Yeah, that's a great answer, actually, because it's
thank you.
The thing that we've realised over these seminars and so on is that adaptive management isn't the opposite of accountability, and trust doesn't mean you're not able to hold yourself accountable for impact. So anyway, final question with our colleague Nick from MFAT.
Thanks, Eve, Josie. Huge thanks to SID for organizing this, and thanks, Leni, for some fascinating insights and pieces to take away. Good food for thought. But so I'm in the partnerships unit at MFAT, and we work with our NGO relationships and funding mechanisms. And so we went to a new kind of type of relationship now in partnership with the NGOs. We're looking at contracting for outcomes and moving away from contracting for outputs, and the smaller pieces. And so that's obviously having an effect on how we do our reporting, as well as how we do our contracting and things like that. But just a question, because I heard you say that we should be, measuring how well people learn, or how well projects learn, and measuring how well projects adapt, in addition to how well they deliver outcomes. And obviously that's adding another level of complexity to our contracts. And any thoughts on how we kind of manage that additional complexity of measuring both outcome, but also how well people are learning, and how we tackle the subjectivity of doing something like that?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Shall I give a few thoughts? I mean, I think I'm not so familiar with your contracting for outcomes model, and I'd love to learn more, so I might follow up with you. I have looked quite a bit at some of the payment by results models that have been used in the UK and some of the European countries. I imagine it might be something similar, but I'm not sure. I think that in some ways, I think at first we were quite hopeful that this would enable, it would give that flexibility for more discretion around your lower level activities, while really kind of holding to those core results that you're aiming to achieve. I think in practice, what I've often seen, and talking to a lot of implementing organizations, is that they've actually ended up with something that has held them to account, including financially, for results, but still required a huge amount of reporting about what they're doing day to day on their activities. And I think I've not seen very good examples yet. So I would love to have them from you if you have them, where genuinely you're implementing a funding arrangement that is a very light touch on reporting of what you're doing day to day, and is really just focused on those end outcomes. So I think a lot of the reality is that the compliance burden has sort of already had this double whammy, because you still have to do all of your reporting that you were kind of doing anyway, but with that on top. So I think I'm interested to see the experience of how this plays out, and if over time we can move towards the model that I think is there, and how you manage the kind of the perverse incentives that, I think in a way what we're talking about is that trust, it's that openness, it's about being able to say where things haven't worked and why, and what you're going to do about it. And if you're being paid on achieving a particular end goal, that obviously can make it quite hard for you to say, well, this isn't working and we're having to figure something else out. So again, to me, I think more hybrid models that maybe at first are more input-based and then move to more outcome-based can work better. But, I think we need to think that through. But I think, so coming to your kind of core point about the compliance better, and I think, it's already there and we do need to be finding ways of shifting it. To me, in a way, I think if an organization, an NGO or an implementer of different kinds, in a way, what I'm saying here shouldn't be anything. It shouldn't be anything that's that new for them if they're already working in these ways. So essentially, what you're saying is, you need to have this regular process of reflection, of learning, of drawing on evidence, and then acting differently or changing your response in light of that. And there are quite lightweight they're quite light ways you can capture some of that. So we've seen organizations that keep things like process diaries, where at the end of a meeting, they just quickly write up, okay, what did we learn, what's changing, and why? And there's a short document that keeps that record. Or there are quick templates that you have. In fact, the Asia Foundation has produced a really nice thing on what they call strategy testing, with a whole set of templates, one-pagers, where you have your theory of change and you can note down, okay, what have we learned, what's changing and why. So I think this doesn't have to be something that requires a 50-page report. It often can be done in quite a light way. What's more important is that the process is genuinely happening. And as a funder, I think how you're going to know that is not by getting the 100-page document to tell you it's happening. It's actually by the nature of your relationship. So it does mean, in the Philippines example, they met weekly with USAID, not for very long, for an hour, but to talk about what they were doing, why. So it requires more staff time on the funder side, because there needs to be a lot more engagement, discussion, conversation. I don't think what it needs is a huge paper, there are light touch ways you can capture some of this, but you need to be confident that that process is genuinely happening. And again, you can say, okay, well, I think often what we see is organizations might have captured really, really good learning, but nothing changed as a result of that. But there are ways you can say, so show me how your project plan has changed in response to that really good learning that you had. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean something new or different. If you've got an updated project plan every quarter, every month, you should be able to see evidence that a shift has happened based on what's been learned. So I think it is really important that we don't add to, we try to remove. My worry is that it will just be something that, like, okay, so now on top of your reporting on your activities and your outcomes, you do a 50-page report on what you've learned, and that will kill us all off, right? I think we need to think about this is a genuine process. Let's be creative about how we can capture that. But it's really, it comes down to the relationship and how you're going to build that relationship and feel confident in it on both sides, so that that openness can happen.
Oh, Leni, that's fantastic. You've actually made it real to all of us, I think, and not to overcomplicate it is the message. I think that this is actually just about being a human, and relationships matter in any sphere of life that we work in, and it's no different in successful outcomes in development. So really grateful to you. The thing I take away from it is fall in love with the problem, not the solution, and you will have to be adaptive and flexible. So Leni, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experiences, and I know that we've all taken a lot away from it. So we will be sharing a link to the recording, and also Leni, you're right to share your slides if I distribute slides to people, and also we'll have a panel discussion later on in the next sort of week or couple of weeks, where we as a community ourselves will get to discuss some of these learnings. But thanks to everybody for coming in late. Thank you, Leni, for coming in so early. I hope you can go and have a nice coffee, and we'll all go and have a nice glass of wine. But yeah, very grateful. Thank you, Leni.
Really thoughtful.
And bye, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leni.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.